I'm Russ Forsberg, and I'm a forester appraiser with American Ag Credit. Well, I grew up in the Berkeley Hills and lived next to a big regional park, so we were outdoors a lot. My older brother and I were Boy Scouts, and we eventually did a lot of backpacking and outdoors activities. My brother is 3 years older, and he decided to go down the street to Cal and get into forestry. It was a good fit at the time for our interests, and I watched over the last 3 years as he started the program, and then I liked it so much I followed him into Berkeley and went into forestry too. So forestry at Cal was great. It was a little weird to live at home and be able to ride my bike down to school, but it was a great way to meet people, and I eventually ended up meeting my wife, who was a forestry student at Cal. And after we graduated, the summer following our graduation, we got married. So it's been a partnership of two foresters in the family ever since. Graduated from school and went up on the North Coast to find a job. In 1978, it was tough pickings for jobs. Not a lot of our graduates got jobs, and I was lucky to get a contract cruising job with Georgia Pacific. Forestry really starts with summer camp after your sophomore year. And my summer camp had, I believe, 135 students, and it was one of the larger summer camps. And in those days, we learned everything about forestry at summer camp, from marking timber to designing roads to learning about habitat management and conservation. At Cal, I was lucky enough to be at the tail end of the old guard. I was taught by Hank Vox, Dennis Teagarden, Bill McBride, George Schultz. It was a great opportunity to get the last final years of those folks' career at Cal, to touch bases with giants in California forestry, and was lucky to spend that time with them. The class being so big, we divided up into different groups. There was the real foresters who really wanted to be foresters, and then there was the other folks that were going to go on to grad school or become doctors or do whatever else they want. So of the 135 or so people in my class, there was probably a nucleus of about 40 to 50 that were really focused on forestry, and we became a pretty close group. That group that graduated with me right now, they are the leaders of California forestry. Each of the large landowners has a Cal grad still leading the charge, and most of those folks are from my class. So it was a great time. It was a time of change, because in those days there was no environmental science, and everybody wanted to be out in the woods. And this was in the early 70s, and we wanted to be involved with nature, and forestry was the ticket for most of us. As far as mentors, we were kind of a small group of my wife Kathleen, Ed Murphy, Neil Ewald, Wendy Johnson. We were kind of a close group, and we kind of went through all the trials and tribulations of forestry at Cal together. And then, of course, when we graduated, we all split off and went off in all these different directions, and it took us a few years to kind of reconnect. So, as I mentioned, I followed my brother's example and got into forestry. And I married a gal from Cal who was a forester. And as it turns out, my brother subsequently married a Cass Green, who's a forester from Cal. And so it was kind of unique to have two foresters in the same family, let alone four. And we ultimately My wife and I had 2 children. My older daughter Elizabeth, who works for the Nature Conservancy, and my younger son Nicholas, who's a forester and works for a timberland investment company in Atlanta. Couple things in that regard. So I was graduated from high school in 1974, so I was the last class to get a draft number. And in 74, the Vietnam War basically came to an end. So I missed that, but I went to school with a lot of veterans, Vietnam veterans. And that was a pretty crazy group of guys, particularly at summer camp. There's usually about 5 years and sometimes 10 years age difference. So even though I was a young 20-year-old, I was running around with 25 and 28-year-olds, and it was quite the experience to spend time with that group. They were a hard drinking and hard playing group of folks. Of course, while I was at Cal, protests were very, very common there. Some of us used to enjoy wearing traditional forestry clothes, stag pants with suspenders, and walking around the protests just to set a different example. But we usually stayed on our corner of the campus just because it had a close group, and it was a safe location. It wasn't in the middle of where the protests were. But we were kind of at the tail end of all that and missed a lot of it. A lot of fun times at the football games. We definitely enjoyed that, but it was pretty reasonably calm. It was in between wars. Jobs are scarce for graduates. When I graduated in 1978, and I felt I was pretty lucky to be able to get a contract timber cruising job with Georgia Pacific in Fort Bragg. I was paid by the plot, which meant you drove out in the woods and you had a plot line to run, and as many plots as you can get done in a day is what you got paid. It was a pretty interesting experience because you had no time to rest. You just kept on going. But for a young man with corks, it was not that hard. We covered a lot of ground and had a lot of fun. I was with a group of guys that was organized by a Cal forester named Alan Knetchley, and he had put together this group, and we used to drive out in the woods in an orange Volkswagen Bug. That was our crummy. And in those days, Georgia Pacific was still running off-highway loads, so these were big loads, large trucks that weren't designed for the highway, and the truck always had the bank when it was driving back to the mill loaded. So depending on what side of the drainage you're on, you had to switch back and forth to allow the truck to have the bank. And in a small Volkswagen, I got to tell you, there were several times where we just missed a truck by the hair of our chins because it was we were going fast to either get up to the woods or get home, and these trucks were lumbering along. And if you weren't paying attention to what side of the road you were driving on, you could run into a Mack truck pretty fast. So that was a pretty hairy experience. Worked most of the summer there. And then ran into a fellow who said that Masonite Corporation, who owned timberlands in Ukiah, was looking to put together an inventory crew. A fellow named Tom Engstrom, who happened to be a teacher aide at, what do they call them? TAs? Teacher assistant at Cal, said, hey, come on over and be a crew leader. You got some experience. So then I spent the next year cruising timber for Masonite. We were based out of Ukiah, and we covered, there are 150,000 acres there on the coast. One day in the fall, I went to a Society of American Foresters dinner in Ukiah and sat next to a guy named Stephen Vanderhorst, who also happened to be a Cal forester. But he was now working as a consulting forester, and he was buying timber on his own. And Steve and I hit up a conversation, and he said he was looking for help in doing consulting work. And so timber cruising was getting pretty boring. So in the fall, touched bases with Steve, signed an agreement, and off the woods I went with Steve and spent a good 2 years working for him and ultimately getting my my registered professional forester license under his direction and experience. So I worked with Steve Vanderhorst until 1985, and the timber market was falling apart, and Steve wasn't able to keep me employed. So I ended up working for a firm that was located down the street from Steve called Scherf and Rao. They were a surveying firm, and I had surveying experience, and at the time that was the beginning of the subdivision of a lot of the big ranches, and I ran a compass crew and a chain, and we flagged all patent parcels on these ranches. And if we stumbled across an old corner, we would mark it and have the surveyor come in and monument it. But our job was just to hang flagging where the approximate location of these parcels were. So I did that for a good 6 to 9 months, waiting for the market to come back. And in the meantime, I had heard about the Federal Land Bank. And the Federal Land Bank was a long-term lender working out of Ukiah, and they were making lots of timber loans, and they were starting to need a forester to help them sort through what they have and do inspections and valuations. And so in 1986, I went to work for the Federal Land Bank of Ukiah, which joined the Federal Land Bank of Eureka and Santa Rosa in a joint hiring of a forester. So I was based in Ukiah, but came up to Eureka and went down to Santa Rosa, and that's how I got started with farm credit. Well, it was an interesting lifestyle. So my wife was working as a forester, and then we had our first daughter, and then I started traveling about up and down the state. So she pretty much had to cover the home front, both in terms of working and helping to raise our daughter. We did that for about a year, and then I was asked to move up to Eureka in 1987 because the majority of the timber loans were had been made out of this Eureka office. So in 1987, Kathy and I and our daughter moved up here. I continued my work at Farm Credit, and Kathy went to work for Blue Lake Forest Products in Blue Lake. And from that point on, it was still a lot of traveling. Farm Credit had made loans all over Northern California, and I met and started working with another forester named Marty Patton, who worked for the Farm Credit Bank in Sacramento. And that continued on for several years until the farm credit banks all started merging to try to get more efficient. And so Marty and I ended up becoming foresters for the same farm credit company, American Ag Credit. And at that point, American Ag Credit decided to start making timber loans outside of California. So our first loans were in Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, and we started working with the lending manager, Sean O'Day, here, and helping to structure and value and monitor timber loans. And these were commercial timber loans ranging in size from 100,000 to 500,000 acres. Over time, that portfolio has grown. We have about 6 million acres of secured loans in about 10 states. And Marty and I are both on staff, and we've just hired another forester from Cal, Elizabeth Ebert. So it's a challenge to keep on top of those loans. We all travel quite a lot. Each of the loans have to be inspected each year. They have to be valued. We have to keep track of the covenants on the loans. But it's been a great growing experience. My time at Farm Credit evolved from just being a forester to becoming a real estate appraiser. And in the 1990s, the savings and loan debacle resulted in having appraisers become licensed. So I was lucky enough to be on the front end of that, and the company paid for me to go through all the education and get the licensing. So not only am I a licensed forester, I'm a licensed real estate appraiser in California and Washington. My experience at Farm Credit has been incredible because not only has it just been valuation, but it's been traveling and monitoring timber loans, helping the lending group structure loans, doing economic forecasts, being a jack of all trades, because one of the things they realized is that foresters are pretty practical and problem solving. So I've been involved with a lot of non-forestry projects that require practical solving skills. Well, American Ag Credit makes loans to timber companies, loggers, and tree farmers. And in a simple way, if you want a loan on a house, an appraiser comes and appraises your house. If you want a loan on your timber, a forester and a licensed appraiser comes and appraises your timber, and that's my job, basically. We make loans on land and timber, so we're valuing we're determining the market value of that property as a whole. We do it on small pieces all the way up to commercial ownerships, up to 1 million acres. We structure our loans based on cash flow. If on a small loan, you're going to cut your trees once every 10 years, we're pretty dependent on looking at your other cash flow. What do you do to make money? If you're a timber company and your job is growing and cutting trees, we are very focused on the cash flows from the property. Early on, we decided that by putting debt on the property can be a help, but we can't push beyond what the sustained yield of the property is. In other words, we can't force the borrower to cut more timber at the expense of the forest to pay the loan. So what we have tried to do over the years is structure the loans so they're in balance with the sustained yield of the property. So the cash flows follow the growth potential of the property and what the long-term sustained yield is. And because of that, we have been able to ride markets up and down as they fluctuate, because we never have over-leveraged these large commercial properties. And so the key is understanding the inventory, understanding the growth potential, and then understanding the markets that the properties are in. My responsibilities here is not only being a forester and doing valuation on timber and timberland, my job also is making sure that all the agricultural appraisal requests are completed. So not only do I do timber appraisals, I do appraisals of cattle ranch and vineyards and dairies and whatever comes up that the lending group needs help. If I can't do it because of time, then I'll contract that out with an outside appraiser. But generally here in Eureka, the flow of work is fairly consistent on the ag side. So I have a whole ag component to my job, which in many ways you might think would be different than forestry, but the reality is it's dealing with natural resources. And it's understanding how things grow or produced and understanding markets. And so actually agriculture and forestry fit very nicely together, dovetail well in together. And so half my job is dealing with agricultural issues here on the North Coast. Appraisal is an interesting field, and every project is different. Even though you might be familiar with a market area, say in Humboldt County, and you know about cattle ranches, you're always facing the challenge of finding comparable sales because properties sell infrequently. You're always appraisal is both quantitative and qualitative analysis, but at the end, it's someone's opinion of what it's worth. And up here, given the comp sales and the issues we deal with, it's more of an opinion. As markets change, it becomes even more difficult. Agriculture does have a lot of challenges. We're lucky to be in California, where agriculture generally is very healthy. There's diverse markets. One of the interesting things here is the dairies in Humboldt County have converted to organic production, which has really changed their cash flows to the positive. But dairies are under a lot of regulatory pressure. Folks from the timber industry in California completely understand that and have been under that kind of pressure for 30 years. Agriculture is starting to see this more and more, and it's really changing how small farmers are behaving. It's raising their costs. And the other issue we have is labor. Labor is very hard to get. Local folks don't want to work in the agricultural industry. We get immigrants that come up this far. We have Hispanic labor, but we're now competing with the marijuana growers. Marijuana growers pay under the table and are in the summertime need growers and trimmers. So it's very difficult for farmers and loggers and operations in legitimate operations here on the North Coast to maintain a labor pool, because the marijuana growers are paying labor cash under the table. That's going to change as the California regulations have kicked in about marijuana growing and legalization. The state will regulate the marijuana industry eventually, as they regulate every other industry. But right now, the regulatory costs, the uncertainty with markets, and the lack of labor are the things that really push family farmers. Yeah, in this job, you work with a variety of folks, farmers, timber growers, and one of the things you get to do is help them realize their dreams or their investments. So, we're providing a service. We're helping them finance acquisitions, helping them provide operating lines so they can keep their business going, helping them for money to repair weather damage. For instance, we have a farm out here in Humboldt County where a dike broke and the property flooded, and he needed money to fix the dike. And we were able to step in very quickly and do that. So farm credit is about servicing farmers and people in the rural area. There's a lot of satisfaction about that. A lot of paperwork, a lot of frustrations many times because you're working for a big company, but we always keep our eye on who really is our main focus, and that's the borrower, who's our customer. I've been involved in very small transactions up to very large transactions. We financed 1.5 million acres in Texas and Louisiana, which was purchased for over $2 billion, and I worked with a group of people who pulled together a syndicate of banks that ponied up about $1 billion to finance that. That was a big project. It was very detailed, had a lot of issues with title, with attorneys, a lot of loan covenant structuring. But when that was done, that was quite satisfying because that was one of the largest loans that was done in the farm credit system. And it was in an area that we hadn't been in before, and it's now been 10 years, and I've gotten to know Texas, eastern Texas and western Louisiana pretty well because of it. So my job has all these kinds of things. I always joke that as soon as I do a large corporate timber loan that's involved, maybe I might get a little bit of ego. It seems like the very next appraisal I'm doing is standing in a dairy with my rubber boots on, measuring buildings. So there's you don't have time for your ego to get too inflated, and that's what I like about it, because there's a lot of variety. Another fun anecdote: my boss came to me and said, well, what do you know about measuring piles? And I said, well, heck, I've measured piles of chips and I've measured piles of logs. And he said, okay, I need you to go to Hawaii and figure out how to measure a pile of sugar in a warehouse. So I went over there for a couple days and figured out how to inventory this warehouse and set it up in such a way as that the loan officer over in the office in Hawaii could routinely measure from known points in this warehouse and how to measure this pile of sugar. So those were the kinds of fun, challenging things that this job entails. So my career on the North Coast over the last 40 years has seen cycles of change, both in terms of economic, as recessions have come and gone, housing markets have come and gone, the environmental impact in terms of regulations and endangered species clearly had a major impact on the industry here on the North Coast. When I first moved up to Eureka in the late 1980s, there was twice the number of sawmills that are here now. They were harvesting timber off the national forests. They were buying local timber. And as the spotted owl in 1990 was listed as endangered, the national forests start curtailing harvesting. Immediately close to home, that impacted my wife's company. Blue Lake Forest Products was a small family-owned sawmill that didn't have timberland and bought timber from the National Forest, and they struggled as the National Forest stopped cutting timber and timber prices went up. And eventually Blue Lake Forest Products closed, and that was a family catastrophe as much as an economic catastrophe, because not only did it impact my wife, it impacted my kids who grew up at the mill. My wife took my son when he was born there and actually kept him in one of the offices there while she was working. And over the years, he would go out and work in the shop and spend time with it. So as we saw that mill close, it changed the family's lifestyle. My kids were friends with kids whose parents lost their jobs, and it was a devastating impact. My daughter got involved with economics and natural resources, got interested in that, and eventually ended up working as a intern at the White House and focused on what can they do under the Bush administration to improve the economic conditions for the forest products industry. That eventually led her to go into working for the Nature Conservancy. Everything that has happened up here has influenced us personally, but the market and other farmers, and I see that every day, of course. So as the environmental issues increased on the forest products industry, the mills closed, less people were employed, and the economic conditions here on the North Coast started to decline. There was a period in the early 80s that was just economically tough for not only the industry but for agriculture, and that continued into the 90s. Then as the timber prices went up due to shortages associated with not selling timber on the national forests anymore, some landowners did really well and others didn't, and that cycled back down. And after the forests were shut down and the mills closed, the demand for timber slackened again. Now we have a base of sawmills, and the interesting thing is just recently the Chinese started buying logs here, so that started pushing log prices back up. Then the dollar relative to the yuan got strong, and the Chinese backed away from buying stuff, so the timber market went back down. Now we're seeing prices cycle back up again because housing is picking up, and redwood is in more demand because of repair and remodeling. So these cycles roll through the economy, and very similar to agriculture. Cattle prices reached a peak 2 years ago and now have crashed. Milk prices cycle up and down, and we were at one point worried about our local dairies here until they started converting to organic production, and that has enabled these small family-run dairies to actually make a generational change. So economics is the thing that ties everything together in natural resources. You can't get away from it. Even if you're in the business of preservation and conservation, you still have to understand the underlying economics. And that's why I like this job, because it sews together understanding economics and valuation and understanding and how natural resources are managed. Cycles for the timber industry used to cycle about every 7 to 8 years. We are on a little longer cycle now. After the Great Recession, the timber market and housing market fell and stayed down, and we've been on a downward or flat trajectory for quite a few years. Slowly but surely now, housing is starting to build up. So we're way beyond. We're in about a 9-year cycle. We're starting to see markets increase, but they'll only go up so high and for so long, and then we'll go through another downward push. American Ag Credit is an agricultural bank that's in California, Colorado, and Kansas. So not only do we have regional diversification, we have different commodity diversification. California has a huge wide range of commodities, and then you throw in the Midwest with the wheat and cows and grains. And so what we have is a company that deals with different cycles with different commodities, but as some commodities are cycling down, other commodities are cycling up. So it used to be as timber goes up, cattle would go down, and as cattle markets go down, timber would go up. So a lot of these commodities are counter-cyclic. Several commodities all cycle together, but the way the company's been structured with regional and commodity diversification, it can withstand these downward cycles in some areas because other areas cycles are up. Well, the future for forestry, I think, particularly for young people, is exciting and strong. Folks my age, we're retiring. Within a few years, most of the folks in my class from Cal will be out the door. We were a bubble, and we were one of the bigger graduating classes. But now we're on out the door. What I'm excited about is the opportunities for younger people, and the neat thing to see, particularly in Northern California, is the diversity of folks getting into forestry, young folks, both in terms of ethnicity and gender, and that's really exciting. So I see a pretty constant demand for foresters here on the North Coast. It isn't huge, but there are always jobs available. You look at my organization, we have 3 foresters, and 2 of them are over 60. So that tells you something right there. Forestry is evolving and changing. The way we look at the environment, the way we work towards sustained yield, that has changed more of the boom and busts, more of a consistent cycle. Yes, over the long run, we will see fewer foresters, but right now we have a lot of older foresters leaving. And so even though we don't see a lot of young kids getting into forestry, the demand is constant. I see it here in California, and I certainly see it up in the Pacific Northwest and in the South, the areas I travel in, where there is the need to have a steady flow of young people willing to come and work as foresters. What I would put in my toolbox if I was a forester is the traditional forestry education, but also I would encourage them to reach out and take business classes, and more imperative than anything else, learn how to communicate, both in terms of writing and in terms of both in terms of writing and in verbal communication. One of the things that I believe in is, as a professional, you are obligated to communicate with the community and explain what you do. Forestry is beyond the days where you can get your degree and run and hide in the woods for your whole career. Foresters have to communicate what they're doing and explain how forests work more than ever, because the population more than ever is based in urban areas and don't understand natural resources and their management. So communication is a key aspect of forestry. Understanding business is another key aspect, and how economics influence forestry. So with that science-based curriculum, you have to have a diversified amount of tools in there that will apply wherever you are in your career. One of the things that I always tell young folks from coming out of school is you get a toolbox of tools when you graduate. Economics, silviculture, inventory, mensuration, and management. And you might not use all those tools right away, but in my career, I have repeatedly, even this late in my career, have opened up my toolbox and found additional tools that I put in there in college, things that I learned that have been helpful to me. In the later years of my career, I'm a manager now. I'm also in charge of a group of appraisers in Northern California. So those management courses I took at Cal that I put in my toolbox 40 years ago, I'm using now. So throughout my whole career, my educational toolbox that I got from Cal has been a big support. Well, I've been really lucky in my career to be able to be involved with forestry all over the country and meet different foresters, meet different farmers, understand the differences and the commonality of growing trees in North America. My career has been blessed by having this opportunity to travel and to work with different forest types. But one common thing I see throughout the country is that the need for young foresters and the need for young foresters to be involved in their profession and involved in their communities. Forestry can't be just going in the woods all day. You have to reach out and have to get involved. And when I was on the Redwood Region Logging Conference, we were giving scholarships to students, and unfortunately it was supposed to be an interview of the student, and I kept getting on my soapbox because it was important to me to make sure these young folks understand that forestry is a responsibility too, not only to the resource you manage, but to the public that you're serving. Part of as I mentioned, my job involves forestry and agricultural appraisal. An important part of my career was when the savings and loan debacle happened and we started becoming licensed appraisers. We had a chief appraiser here on staff named Harvey Fries, who was instrumental in assisting our core crew of appraisers in developing our profession, encouraging us to take the courses, encouraging us to get designated beyond just getting a license. I'm an accredited rural appraiser with American Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers. That course that I took to get licensing and accreditation was mentored by Harvey Fries. And he was a big aspect of and a big part of my true appraisal career. My management now of this team of appraisers, I think back about how Harvey managed the group and tried to emulate some of the management skills Harvey showed us. I am a volunteer on the City of Arcata's Forest Advisory Committee. I've been on that committee over 28 years. For a large part of that time, I was the chairman. The City of Arcata manages a large forest, to the east of town and is well known for its long-term management of the forest. In many times we've had issues where we've laid out timber harvests where people have protests. My approach and the committee's approach has always been to try to communicate and educate. So we have always made a point of reaching out to the local college, Humboldt State University, inviting students, teachers, and citizens to come out and tour the woods with us, see what we're doing, come to our advisory meetings, and to talk. And the important thing is also to listen to their concerns, find a common thread that we can all agree, and then work from there to try to resolve some of these conflicts. You're not going to brainwash these folks or change their ways of thinking, and they're based on very honest and forthright ways of thinking. The key would be to explain where you think they don't understand issues and try to agree that there are some issues that we can work with. You'll never get people to completely agree to timber harvesting or forest management, but if they understand what's going on and are basing this disagreement on facts, then that's the best you can do. So over the years, we've had student groups and protesters and all kinds of folks that we've had to deal with. And again, communication in a two-way communication, not preaching, and then making sure you listen and truly understand what their concerns are. Fortunately, there haven't been very many because we haven't had many foreclosures because of the way we structure loans and how we work with borrowers. But there have been times where I've been the Johnny on the spot going out and visiting a farmer on his ranch after he was turned down or had been given some bad news. Again, my strategy there is to listen to what he has to say, to try to explain, as I know it, the company's position, and promising him that I'll take his concerns back to the loan officer and make sure he or she understands what the farmer's issues are. I find that going into highly charged situations, if you listen to their point of view and let them explain however in whatever form they want, I think that goes a long way to de-escalating the issue. People many times just want to complain, and they just want someone to hear it. And many times I find it's the appraiser who ends up hearing that. But that's part of the job, and fortunately it's few and far between. And most of those folks I still see today because they're still borrowers. Because in the end, what we are trying to do for them is make sure that they don't overcommit themselves to leverage and debt. And even though that got them angry at the time, I think in the long run they realized that we were trying to not only look out for the company, but look out for them. So I became a member of Society of American Foresters when I was a student at Cal. And since it is a professional organization, I always felt the need to belong and be aware of not only issues and policies on a state level, but on a national level. Frankly, of course, the magazine is very helpful in keeping touch with the society. In my earlier career, the society had chapters on the North Coast in Humboldt County and down in Mendocino County. Then as the forestry licensing got more involved, the California Licensed Foresters became organized, and they did a lot of organization and meetings. They have weekly breakfast meetings. And so what's happened is there's been kind of a shift between meetings focused on local issues that are worth attending, and then national meetings and statewide meetings for educational purposes that the society offers. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy. Both organizations have a lot of the same members. One is more of a state focus, one is more national focused. One is more immediate solving of political issues. One is the society is more focused on education and long-term issues. As a professional, I think it's important to belong to a professional society. I have not been as active as a member and a leader in society, though I have been involved with the Forestry Institute for Teachers for 24 years. The Forestry Institute for Teachers was started over in Reading by a group of Society American foresters who wanted to improve the education of teachers about natural resources and particularly timber management. The following year, we started that same program here on the coast, and folks first with first with Kim Rodriguez and Forrest Tilley, and then as time went on, Kim moved on, and Jana Valikovic. Forrest was a key component of our fit for at least the first 10 years. He was a great believer in education, and much of my faith in education I got from Forrest and his way of reaching out to teachers and students and teaching them about education, about natural resources. I continue to work with the Society of American Foresters and the Forestry Institute for Teachers, and currently still involved with it. We're pretty proud of the forestry conference here. We typically go through 35 teachers a year. They spend a week with us, and we expose them to all aspects of forestry and natural resource management, including exposure and communication with the environmental community. So our approach is to try to develop a balanced presentation. Most of the attendees think it's an outstanding program. We always have a few that are not receptive, but the majority have been extremely receptive, and so 24 years by about 35 teachers, we've impacted quite a lot of people. The Society has provided an umbrella type support for the Forestry Institute for Teachers, and has been coordinating, and we now have 3 sessions, one here in Humboldt County, one in Reading, and one in the Southern Sierras. And it has been through the Society that this has been possible, both in terms of its umbrella and its 501c3 structure, but in terms of the energy of the NorCal Society. I've been lucky enough to work for a company that encourages community involvement. So over the years, not only being involved with the Forestry Institute for Teachers and volunteering on the advisory committee for the Arcata City Forest, I've been involved with the Redwood Region Logging Conference and actually was president of the conference 10 years ago. I enjoy the opportunity to donate time to different organizations because, again, I believe that's a professional obligation. You know, the society has ebbed and flowed, and one of the things that is interesting to me is it's having a harder time connecting with younger students who graduate with a forestry degree and go off and start a forestry career. How do you get those younger folks involved? And here we have Humboldt State University with a fairly robust forestry school. I know there's a student chapter, but yet the society doesn't have a local chapter. It's a matter of leadership and interest, and then the problem is who should be the leader and who has the interest. I think that's the issue. But I think the society, to grow, to evolve, has to make sure that these young folks know it's there, understand what it provides, and finds a way to get them to join. My ideal forest is based on my career experience. I'm a redwood forester, And I've seen forest types all over the country. Um, Douglas fir forests in the Pacific Northwest, high elevation fir forests up in Idaho, um, hardwood forests in Pennsylvania, New York, southern yellow pine in the south. And even though all those forests are interesting and different and pretty in their own way, I am partial to redwood because I've grown up here and I lived in it. My ideal forest would be the thing I would want to own would be approximately 1,000 acres of second growth redwood. I um, I I think a second growth redwood forest, if managed correctly, can produce an excellent income, at least periodically, and provides recreational and environmental outputs that I think if you manage them correctly, could benefit society and give you the satisfaction of having a beautiful property to work with. Redwood is a unique species that even after working with it for 40 years, I'm still surprised at some of the things that we bump into, particularly working on the Arcata City forest, which is generally a 100-year-old second growth forest. It is incredible the different views, the way trees grow. I learn something every time I go out in the woods in a redwood forest. My career has been both in terms of service to the farmer and the tree grower, but to the public. And I got to tell you, the most satisfying part of my career is to work really hard and then have time while you're out in the woods to stop and take a view, maybe walk down through a stand, and the ability just to let time slow down a little bit. And it's been that kind of combination of hard work, intensiveness, with the opportunity to take a break that has energized me. And I think whether my son is a forester, he's seen the light, and I hope my grandson gets the opportunity to do this, because it's been a wonderful career, and it has been the most satisfying life experience I've had.